Hey, my name's Kyle Takada, and today I'll be presenting my research project on methamphetamine in post-war Japan. For my research, I turned to numerous credible articles, journals, and websites to investigate how meth impacted Japanese society, specifically from the years 1952 to 1956, which can all be found in the annotated bibliography linked on the last slide. I was super interested in this topic because I love learning about Japanese history. My dad's family is actually from Japan, but they moved here in the 1970s and assimilated into American culture. So I unfortunately don't know much about my family history, but I always love to learn about Japan whenever I can. So let's start from the very beginning. After years of fighting each other in World War II, on August 9th, 1945, the United States infamously dropped two atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The bombings were tragic and killed an estimated 200,000 civilians, with many more injured and additional deaths from radiation exposure. Japan had no choice but to surrender to the United States, as this was the first and only use of nuclear weapons in the war. Japan officially surrendered on September 2nd, 1945, although Emperor Hirohito verbally announced the decision weeks earlier on August 15th. After the Japanese surrendered, the Allied powers set up a coalition which would occupy Japan. It was led by U.S. General Douglas MacArthur and was focused with the goal of disarming and reforming military, modifying the political system, and rebuilding the economy. The coalition was called the Supreme Command of Allied Powers, or SCAP, S-C-A-P for short. Fast forward a couple years, in 1947, SCAP shifted its main focus from originally demilitarizing and punishing Japan for its alleged war crimes to rebuilding Japan's economy, as fear of communism spreading in East Asia was a big deal in the United States government after Mao Zedong took control of China. This period was referred to as the reverse course, in which SCAP, under MacArthur's command, started to implement anti-inflation policies and new tax reforms, mimicking those of the US. They also attempted to break up large Japanese business conglomerates in hopes of turning Japan's economy into a free market. But perhaps the biggest break SCAP received in their 7-year occupation of Japan was the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950. When the war started, Japan became the primary supply depot of the UN forces, which helped the Japanese economy grow immensely. Many occupation officials were quoted with saying things like, "Korea came along and saved us." The Korean War helped Japan's economy so much that by 1952, SCAP had determined that Japan was able to govern themselves. In fact, the US was so concerned about the spread of communism, in just 7 years, the reemergence of the Japanese Empire was the least of their worries. With a new set of political, economic, and military reforms, the stage was set in Japan for the widespread emergence of methamphetamine soon to come in 1952. Methamphetamine was mass-produced during World War II in most major wartime nations, including the United States, Germany, Great Britain, and of course Japan. In Japan, it was known as Hiropon, and the Japanese military used it as a stimulant for pilots on long flights, tired soldiers, or civilians working in the factories. In 1945, when SCAP assumed control of post-war Japan, they started to confiscate the government's stockpile of wartime drugs, which consisted of all sorts of drugs. They scattered the supply in caves, supply depots, military hospitals, and industrial bases. However, there is substantial evidence that a lot of these drugs, including Hiropon, were secretly resold on the black market. As SCAP began rebuilding the social policies in Japan, in 1946, they placed harsh restrictions on both opium and marijuana, while allowing Hiropon, also known as methamphetamine, to remain fully legal. This is mainly because the worldview had not yet shifted as it pertained to stimulant drugs. Remember, SCAP is the US government agency, not a Japanese agency. They truly did not recognize the apparent risk and devastating consequences this would have on the Japanese people in years to come. During my research, I found a very interesting story in a Japanese newspaper that was recently published, and it was the story of a lady named Kazuku Omeda, who was a high school senior in 1945 in Osaka during World War II, and she tells a story about how she recounts being tasked with wrapping a bunch of small individual chocolates and was told by her teachers that they'd be sent out to soldiers. And like any curious high school kids, her and her friends decided to steal some of the chocolates and try them after school. And when they put them in their mouth, none of them had done methamphetamine before, but they recall feeling a very strange and burning sensation when eating them. And they later found out that the chocolates were laced with methamphetamine, and those were the chocolates that were being sent out to the pilots and soldiers who needed stimulants. So just a very interesting kind of foreshadowing to what was to come in Japanese society. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, without any government restrictions on stimulants, this would be still when SCAP was in control, and they did not put any restrictions on the stimulants. Over 20 large companies were producing Heropon for the Japanese people to consume. It was marketed as a cure for low blood pressure, sleepiness, and sluggishness. Unsurprisingly, Heropon sales skyrocketed, and the demand for the drug became alarming. Something interesting to note is SCAP attempted to counteract this exploding new drug by prohibiting its production in both powder and pill forms in 1949. So SCAP was aware that this was beginning to be a problem, and they wanted to take action. This ultimately caused manufacturers to produce Heropon as an injectable liquid instead of a powder. And at the time, Japanese society welcomed both the syringe and hypodermic needle as a way of injecting drugs, as they viewed it as a scientific advancement and an ode to East Asian medicine. So essentially, SCAP's objective to compress the exploding new drug only made this crisis worse, because as we know, mainlining any drug directly into your bloodstream makes the drug exponentially more potent and addictive. And after SCAP finally withdrew from Japan in late 1951, the Japanese Diet, which is their legislative branch, essentially, they officially banned stimulants in Japan with what was known as the Kakuzizai Torishimari Ho. So once 1952 comes around, we really see the Heropon crisis take off in Japan. By late 1951, the Japanese police had arrested nearly 10,000 suspects for methamphetamine-related crimes in the month of December alone, so December 1951. This would start a common theme where Heropon would work its way into other illegal activities, including robbery, arson, rape, extortion, assault, and many more horrible crimes. The new and blossoming Heropon industry gave criminals a stable area to operate in. At first, most of the illegal Heropon production was done on a low-level scale, in the houses and apartments of people looking to make quick money. But by late 1955, police started exposing huge production operations in large cities like Tokyo and Osaka that had multiple manufacturing locations. They had a large group of staff and earned tens of millions of yen annually. The publicity that these operations received in Japan shocked many, and they started to expose the real scale of the issue to the Japanese public. Additionally, an alarming study in May 1954 revealed that 7.5% of people were using Heropon out of 100% of the population of Japan. And of that 7.5%, 75% of users were injecting 5 or more times a day, which is an insane statistic. Just the rate of consumption is kind of mind-boggling. It was estimated that by the end of 1954, a total of 1.5 million people in Japan were Heropon users, 20% of whom were seriously addicted. To think that just 10 years ago, Heropon was mainly found as a substance given to military it just really outlines the rapid explosion of the crisis at hand. But fortunately, by 1956, all of these alarming statistics start to decline rapidly, and the crisis by 1956, as we know it, is essentially over. Japan's ability to deal with the Heropon crisis is a distant outlier to almost every major nation's attempt to wage a war on drugs. If we think of America, for example, the war on drugs has been a complete and utter failure for the last 40 years, using the policies for political gain rather than social reformation. There's many factors as to why Japan was able to overcome the crisis so quickly and effectively. It essentially only lasted for 4 years, from 1952 to 1956. The first reason being that there's evidence to suggest that while the general public in Japan realized the Heropon crisis as a problem, because remember, only 7.5% of the population was addicted, compared to 92.5% of the population was not addicted or using. There was general optimism around Japan that the problem would be resolved. All signs point to the fact that the ban on methamphetamine was also very effective in slowing the crisis. the one that the Japanese Diet passed in 1951. Society in Japan is built upon incredible principles of respect and courtesy from individual to individual, and generally most of these individuals are avid rule followers. So law and order in Japan is a real thing, and to this day they still have some of the lowest crime rates in the world. A combination of the newly recovering nation's optimism, paired by effective government policies and intervention, proved effective in eradicating the Hirapon crisis by late 1956. After the Hirapon crisis was over, Japan experienced a high increase in economic growth. This new and thriving society gave rise to organized crime syndicates, such as the Yakuza, who essentially took full control of the illegal methamphetamine trade in Japan post-1956. As the nation started to rebuild, the Yakuza started to spread its wings internationally, creating a network of crime in Korea, China, Taiwan, Myanmar, and other small countries in Southeast Asia. The Yakuza became so powerful that in the early 1970s, Japan saw another surge in methamphetamine use and production, in the form of a new compound called shabu. The quote-unquote second stimulant wave was small in comparison to both the Hirapon crisis and the simultaneous war on drugs other powerful nations like America were fighting at the time. But unlike the Hirapon crisis, Japan was never able to fully suppress it like they were in the 1950s, making it a real outlier in the war on drugs. While Japan has statistically some of the lowest crime rates in the world, based on the size of its population, it still struggles with drugs in its society like all other large nations in the world. Back in 2001, it was estimated that 1.7% of Japan's population were still abusing methamphetamine. So thank you again for listening to my project on the methamphetamine crisis in Japan from 1952 to 1956. I had a great time researching and putting this together. It was super interesting to think about members of my own family who I knew that lived through this and probably experienced this crisis firsthand. All of the research is in the annotated bibliography on the following slide, and I hope you have a great day.